I don't, yeah. Hey, Al. Great to be here. Thanks for coming out. So, I guess to kick things off, I just wanted to let y'all know, like, I'm not actually really going to be addressing the question of where have all the radicals gone. Sorry. That was kind of a little bit of provocation, hoping that maybe some self-identified radicals would come out and participate in this conversation, discussion, presentation. So yeah, I just wanted to get that on the table so that y'all don't just like wait through the whole presentation and be like, the question wasn't answered. But with that being said, really the main impetus for this sort of talk and discussion is the fact that I've been having conversations with folks sort of on the edges of different psychedelic communities for the last 3 to 5 years. And it seems like there's a wide range of social and political issues that are present in psychedelic communities that aren't really being discussed in the more mainstream conversations that are taking place as psychedelics are getting sort of renewed focus and media attention and things of that nature. And so I've really been trying to sort of push these things into the spotlight, not because I have any answers, but because I think these discussions are really important, and I think their absence is kind of alarming, especially as psychedelics are becoming more prominent, as certain organizations are developing various agendas and pushing them forward. And we as psychedelic individuals, users, people who are part of these communities, are in a position where maybe we don't get as much say or have as much influence over these discussions as I think we should. So with that being said, I just want to define a couple terms that I'll be throwing around. First is radical. When I use radical, I'm really trying to discuss the concept of getting at the root of things, the foundation, fundamental components. So, you know, in the sense of where have all the radicals gone, really where are the people that are interested in focusing on the underlying structures, the systems, the institutions, the components of our society that we don't really have much say in or control over, and that fundamentally need to be reworked if we want to be able to build freer, more autonomous societies. Second is dominant culture. I use this as a little bit of a catch-all to refer to the most powerful, widespread, or influential components of societies and political entities. And so this refers to things like capitalism, industrial civilization, patriarchy, white supremacy. And when I use the term, I'll kind of be throwing it around in a few different ways, mostly because it's an easy catch-all. You'll see the context change a little bit, but it just makes it a really easy reference point. And so if it seems to get used in slightly different ways, that's why. And then finally, structural analysis, which is this idea that we have to unpack society as a complex system whose various structures and institutions really affect all of us. And that if we want to engage in actual change, and if we want to address the problems that we face in our daily lives, it's not really just about what we see on the surface and the various actors and events that take place, but rather about these deeper, more entrenched systems and institutions and the things that we didn't really have any say in putting into motion. We haven't had any say as far as how they've affected us throughout our lives, and that ultimately, I think in a lot of ways, we get told, you know, this is just how it is. And so if we're going to get into discussions about things like, you know, when folks say, well, if we just give enough people acid, then, you know, we'll be able to end war and poverty and things like that, right? Like, if you can't actually advance some sort of explanation through the structures and institutions of society, that's not really a position that you can hold down in any meaningful way. And so I think that we have to be engaged with those structures and institutions and be able to present coherent critiques of them to explain, you know, not only what we're looking for, but how we might get there if we're interested in getting there. And so with that being said, you know, I'd like to make a few basic assertions. First is that we're all witnesses and participants in, whether willingly or not, a variety of destructive systems. These are things like ecocide, capitalism, patriarchy, again, dominant culture, right? And we don't really have much say in that, just based on how society functions and our own need to find survival and safe spaces within society. So secondly, the fact that psychedelics can offer radical shifts in perspective on things like personal identity, mortality, feelings of well-being, openness, relationships between self and nature, and a variety of others. And I'm not saying this because I want to essentialize psychedelic experiences, but rather because if you look through some 60 years of trip reports and authored works like Huxley's Doors of Perception, and other pieces that have come from psychedelic users, you see that some of these themes emerge as pretty consistent components of psychedelic experiences. Now, obviously, that's not an exhaustive list, but I think the fact that these things crop up with such regularity leads to the conclusion that psychedelic insights are inherently political. And the reason that I would assert that is because when we look at how we're situated in society, and we see the way that some of these insights crop up and the tensions that they present between ourselves and the broader structures of society, there is a tension there. There's a fundamental disagreement. There are contradictions. And ultimately, if we understand politics as power relationships, then as we're breaking down those relationships and understandings, as we try to examine the various forces that are acting on us in day-to-day life, we come away with political understandings as a result of our psychedelic use, or we can. And finally, it seems kind of obvious, but having been in these circles for a while, I think it's important to say that, like, realizations don't equate to action. There's a lot of talk, there's a lot of people who like to present themselves as woke or conscious or whatever distinguishers they like to make, and frankly, I don't really think it matters how you refer to yourself or how you see yourself in that sense if you're not putting those understandings into action. Because at the end of the day, like, it's nice to have the insight, it's nice to have the realizations, it's cool to be able to meet other people that you can, you know, sort of empathize and commiserate with about how fucked we are. But at the same time, like, you know, if you don't do something about it, I don't know, like, what's going on there. Like, it seems like there needs to be some sort of applied action to make any of those insights meaningful. And so to come back to this notion that psychedelics are political, I think it's important to sit with the full body of those broader themes of psychedelic experiences, right? Like, if we sit with the idea that psychedelics can facilitate experiences where we feel deep, loving, entrenched connections to nature and ecosystems and the life around us, and then we come back to a daily life where we look around and we see that our laptops, our cell phones, all of the technology we use on a daily basis, the way we transport ourselves, I mean, hell, just what it takes to support a festival like this, we see that it's all steeped in industrial civilization and ecocide, right? And, like, as you come down, as you find yourself sitting with these understandings or the realizations, the experienced knowledge that ecological integrity is significant, is important, is ultimately necessary for us to exist as humans on this planet. And then you look around at a society that's basically operating fundamentally at odds with that, it seems like there's a tension there that should necessitate action, that, like, if you're under threat, you need to take steps to protect yourself. Similarly, if we look at even something as basic kind of as this, or perhaps cheesy even, as this notion that psychedelics can facilitate loving experiences or present messages of love is the most important force in the universe, all you need is love, you know, things along those lines. And then you step out of your house into a world where there's trillion-dollar advertising budgets that are all being spent telling you that you're unlovable, that you're incomplete, that you as a human being are fundamentally lacking some core component unless you buy, you know, whatever sort of beauty products or material goods that will fill that hole, that will make you fully functional, that will make you acceptable and lovable to your peers. Again, we see that same tension there between how we're situated within society and these felt realizations that can come through psychedelics. So I don't think it's surprising that when we look historically, we find that there's a huge number of groups that emerged throughout the 60s that had radical political critiques and were explicit in their psychedelic use. And this is by no means an exhaustive list. These are just some groups that I personally enjoy. And one of the things that I think is really interesting about this period of time is that there was solidarity between the explicitly psychedelic and the not so psychedelic groups. So, for example, when Tim Leary got locked up for possession, the Brotherhood of Eternal Love hired the Weathermen to bust him out. And in the course of doing so, after he was broken out of jail and hidden for days and weeks, and then ultimately wound up in alongside Eldridge Cleaver from the Black Panther Party over in Algeria. And, so seeing that there was that solidarity between the Black Panthers and more explicitly psychedelic groups, people that were interested in changing society and didn't really care so much where the understandings and insights were coming from, as long as they were there. And so that, again, seems to present a stark difference from where things were 50, 60 years ago and where things are today, when we consider that presence of political critique, the fact that we found radical politics going hand in hand with social activism, and looking at other groups here like the Diggers, who engaged in free markets and food distribution programs, looking at the Panthers and their what they called life raft programs, free breakfasts in schools, essentially programs that acknowledged that the material reality of daily life needed to be addressed, and that even though these projects weren't going to bring about a new world, even though they were sort of these prefigurative ideas, they were necessary in order to provide people with the basic materials that they needed to function within society. And so seeing that level of solidarity at this point coming out of both psychedelic and non-psychedelic activist groups, seeing that solidarity and that engagement, I think is really significant and is something that in many ways is lacking today. So of course, like that level of engagement with ideas that challenged fundamental structures of society led to governmental repression. This quote comes from John Ehrlichman, an advisor to Nixon, and he said, "The Nixon campaign in 1968 and the Nixon White House after that had two enemies, the anti-war left and black people. We knew we couldn't make it illegal to be either against the war or black, but by getting the public to associate the hippies with marijuana and blacks with heroin, and then criminalizing both heavily, we could disrupt those communities. We could arrest their leaders, raid their homes, break up their meetings, and vilify them night after night on the evening news. Did we know we were lying about the drugs? Of course we did." So here you have it essentially from the horse's mouth, right? Telling us that this isn't about drugs, this is about the politics and the political power that they represented. That these things fundamentally served as vectors for them to get into communities that they wanted to disrupt. And this raises a whole bunch of questions along lines of legitimacy and authority when we look at psychedelic use today and sort of the way it's coming back. But I think it's really important not to let this slip through the cracks because, again, they're willing to put this down. They gave interviews where all of these facts were laid bare, and they don't feel a need to hide it. And that's largely because the repression was successful. It was carried out in such a way through misinformation, disinformation, and a bunch of propaganda that ultimately attempted to paint psychedelics as harmful to individuals, when in fact the reason they were criminalized was because they were potentially harmful to entrenched systems of power, precisely because they could facilitate insights, and they can facilitate insights that put us fundamentally at odds with the people that are interested in controlling society, whether you're talking about corporate CEOs or political figures. There's a clear tension between psychedelic insights and what those 5, 10, 20-year plans would look like. So it's also important to remember that, as this governmental repression kicked off, there was a whole bunch of DIY projects that were going on as well, right? People moved underground, people attempted to combat the various misinformation that was spilling out, and it was really a shit show. It was kind of a mess. It became really easy Tim Leary at one point found himself looking at serious jail time over a joint. He wasn't alone in that. And so looking at the way that they swung this really heavily should give some insight as to the degree to which they're willing to come after folks engaged in using these compounds, again, because of the threat perceived. And obviously it wasn't just drug users. So in the US, one of the more notable programs of repression was called COINTELPRO, which stood for Counterintelligence Program. And this was an FBI program that was started in the mid-50s by Herbert Hoover with the explicit intention of sidelining and ultimately disempowering a variety of movements in the US. So this included the Black Power movement, the American Indian movement, communists, anarchists, the Puerto Rican liberation movement, and they explicitly targeted folks like Dr. Martin Luther King, Malcolm X. There was actually a civil suit recently in the U.S., I think in the last 5 or 10 years, that was found, against the U.S., the government, and found that they had been implicated in some of the components leading up to that assassination. And so actually the original order for wiretapping King came from Bobby Kennedy and was then expanded under Hoover, precisely because he felt that the civil rights struggle and the Black Panther Party and Black Power movement represented some of the greatest threats to American actions at home, domestically. And so sort of after all of this repression kicked off, psychedelics didn't go away. Drugs didn't go away, obviously. They moved to the underground, and there was a really rich history and culture around do-it-yourself projects, around homegrown publications, around sharing information and trying to pass on as much as possible around these compounds. And obviously, when it was forced underground, it fundamentally changed what that looked like. It created a lot more risk. It created a lot more challenges to getting accurate information. And we see, even with therapists that were engaged in psychedelic interventions, with people who were carrying out their own research, most of these folks didn't stop, even if publicly they sort of presented this notion that they had. They continued the research, they just couldn't be as open about it. And so this led to the creation of a whole bunch of different underground networks. And as we had the advent of the internet and increasing participation in forums, discussion boards, email lists, things like that, all of a sudden some of these folks really started linking up with each other, and communities, to whatever degree we can have digital communities, started to form around these experiences and compounds. So again, we had this sort of reaffirmation that people were engaged, interested, pursuing work with these things. And I think that that's really important to acknowledge, to recognize that psychedelics didn't go away, because one of the things that has become a really common term is the psychedelic resurgence, or the second psychedelic revolution, or things that basically present this picture of psychedelics disappeared and then they came back. And I think that kind of whitewashes a lot of these underground histories and pushes them to the margin. I think it's really important to kind of dig into that history, to look at things like Tripzine and the Entheogen Review and these other threads that really carried on over the decades, where psychedelics were much more taboo than they are today. But that said, there is clearly an ongoing and increasing engagement with psychedelics, especially with regards to dominant culture. So if we look at the psychedelic resurgence, I think there's sort of 3 main pillars of that. The first being psychedelic research. This is both sanctioned and underground. I'm not really going to talk about underground today, just because it's played a fundamentally different role. I have given talks on that as well. They're available on YouTube. Feel free to check them out, or we can talk about it during the Q&A. But as far as sanctioned research, I think that that's played a really strong role in this resurgence, precisely because it makes it really easy to present to straight culture, right? At the point where you can say, look, mushrooms are therapeutic. They're being used for the treatment of end-of-life anxiety, and they've been this successful. Or look, MDMA for the treatment of treatment-resistant PTSD has actually been pretty damn successful. And so, how can you deny people who need these medicines access to them? And if you go through things like ayahuasca, iboga, ibogaine, and various other ethnobotanicals, you see that there are really easy arguments to make for legalization through that sort of medical pathway. So second is festival cultures and art movements, visionary art, music. These things have clearly propagated psychedelic culture around the world, and the degree to which You can now find festivals, both small and large, compared to, say, a decade ago or 20 years prior or 30 before that, is telling. And I think, the fact that these events are spawning new events, that they're sending little offshoots off, is really telling, and again, makes this a clear second pillar of this resurgence. And then finally, psychedelic markets, whether we're talking about the so-called dark web and the ability to source drugs online like that, the ethnobotanical marketplace of gray area vendors selling live and dry plants, people that you meet at events like this who are bringing the market into the real world, or other places, the availability of these compounds in our society, combined with these prior two components, I think really sort of solidifies psychedelics and this particular resurgence as here to stay, at least for the foreseeable future. So with that being said, if we look at the medical model, it's currently the dominant paradigm within psychedelic research. And it makes sense for a number of reasons. Like I said, it's really easy to present this information to straight folks, to people that you want to bring into the community, to people that you want to convince. You've just had your first trip and your parents are wondering if you blew your mind out. Being able to send them peer-reviewed papers from Johns Hopkins makes it a lot easier to articulate certain justifications. That said, there's no real engagement in this particular body of research with broader social questions and themes. And I think that one of the things that gets lost in this discussion, right, when you try to justify your use as being legitimate because it's tied to these therapeutic models, is the fact that it doesn't necessarily need to be therapeutic in order to be legitimate, and that none of these compounds were criminalized because they presented acute personal harm, because they presented physical symptoms that were particularly detrimental. And so, there's not really a good argument that these things should solely be brought back in a medical context. There's not justification for it, in my mind, based on the manner in which they were criminalized. And I think, pointing out that there is this emphasis on rescheduling and legalization within the medical field is significant, precisely because it puts these compounds into a medical context. It gives certain people control over who has access to them. It raises questions about what if you're not ill? What if you're not somebody who feels the need to encounter these things for therapeutic purposes? Maybe you have spiritual interests. Maybe you just want to enjoy them recreationally. I think all of those things are valid, and they don't actually get addressed through this therapeutic approach. So then if we look at festival cultures, I think it's safe to say that these have been pretty instrumental in propagating psychedelic culture. And I think at the base of that, it's understandable, right? Like, these essentially function as containers for psychedelic experiences, as places where you can come, where you're not going to be looked at as being weird or out of the ordinary if you happen to be tripping real hard in the middle of a large group of people, right? Despite all of the overwhelming components, the heat, the light, the noise, the massive amounts of people, these are particularly designated spaces for having these experiences, and having these experiences around other people who can provide support, who can, who understand what's going on, who are capable of engaging with you where you're at. Now, at the same time, I think there's a lot of talk at festivals, particularly by festivals, about festivals as prefigured utopias, about festivals as providing alternative ways of being in the world and challenging dominant paradigms and this, that, and the other. And I don't really think a lot of that holds up when we actually examine it. Looking at some of the political projects that festivals like Burning Man have taken on, where you have the Bureau of Erotic Discourse, precisely because there have been so many instances of sexual assault, rape, and other problems around consent. There are people who argue that there's no need for political projects in festival spaces, and I think we see that that's clearly not the case. Additionally, I think there's a lot of really difficult discussions to be had around cultural appropriation in some of these spaces, and sort of what makes a costume, what people are borrowing from whose cultures and why, sort of how we engage with other people in our community and what that looks like. And it's been nice to see some more facilitated discussions around that, particularly involving Indigenous folks in some festivals. I think there needs to be a hell of a lot more of that, and I think that while festivals do operate and give people the potential to engage in these experiences and spaces, I think a lot of what gets said about the political merits that they offer to the community at large is a little bit overblown. And that's just my opinion. I think that it would be nice to see more political engagement coming out of these spaces and more actual, real-world organization. Because to talk about community that appears for 4 days and then disappears, I think raises a lot of interesting questions about how we conceive of community and what we actually mean by community. What actual projects come out of a community that exists for 4 days? Because unquestionably, there are communal experiences that take place here. So I think the big question is, all right, then what do we do with that? And when it comes to psychedelic markets, I'm not really a big fan of the way the marketplace currently looks. It's kind of a shit show, whether we're talking about festivals and seeing the drugs that are being misrepresented as drugs they're not, simply so people can turn a profit, whether we're talking about the ethnobotanical vendors and the gray area plants that are being sold, people, again, misrepresenting plants, people making false claims, people trying to do their best to make as much money as possible off of these plants. And I think that this notion of, as much as psychedelic markets have really facilitated the spread through facilitating the availability of these compounds, the degree of commodification that's taking place, I think, has the potential to shift the focus from the merit of these experiences, from what they're capable of facilitating, from actual meaningful discussions about psychedelic insight, into this sense of psychedelics as having particular economic value and being able to bring in X, Y, Z number of dollars or hold certain spaces, people who've tied their events or other interests to pushing various compounds, I think makes for a lot of problems. And I think it puts the emphasis in the wrong place. I think we've seen, at harm reduction projects, what happens when, when dealers rock up with a bunch of 25I pretending that it's acid. It doesn't go well. And ultimately, we as the community all suffer through that. We all have to find ways of engaging with that. And so, as much as psychedelic marketplaces have brought psychedelics to folks, they've also presented a whole lot of problems. And this notion of mainstreaming psychedelics, right? The notion that psychedelics belong out there, maybe in every corner store, or understood as by maybe all of your family members and being present in ways where they're no different than booze or anything else you might encounter freely as you currently do. I think it raises a lot of questions. Again, going back to the tensions that I think exist between some of these psychedelic insights and the societies in which we live, I think the first question we have to ask is why? What do we actually get from mainstreaming psychedelics? And I think that the folks who are pushing these narratives about mainstreaming psychedelics are mostly coming from the medical perspective. And so the why that's frequently given is that patients need access, and by making psychedelics available, we're essentially bettering society. But if we actually look at what's taking place, it's not so much about bettering society, it's about bettering these individuals. And in doing that, we're essentially returning them to society to continue functioning in these destructive and problematic ways. So there needs to be engagement with that question, I think. We also have to ask who or what is mainstream? At what point do we consider something to reach that tipping point? For me, it seems like mainstream concepts would include things, all of the institutions and components of dominant culture. So we see that what is currently mainstream is actually incredibly destructive, and I don't know that there's merit in making psychedelics, stand alongside those things as, hey, look, it's another thing that's available to everyone. And not even being available to everyone, but just having it standing out there in that same context as all of these other social components. Which then leads to this question of, is it disruptive, right? If we have tension between psychedelics and aspects of dominant culture, then I would expect to see a certain amount of disruptive results from mainstreaming psychedelics. I mean, this was some of the strong fear that came out of the 60s, the notion that psychedelics would upset the apple cart because they were facilitating understandings that were so at odds with dominant social paradigms. So if we look at what's going on now, if we look at things like the interest in microdosing, say LSD for productivity in the workplace, right? You could make the argument that that presents this other disruptive potential, right? That rather than psychedelics disrupting society, you have this notion of sort of disrupting the boundary dissolving aspect of psychedelics and instead turning them into productivity enhancers that can bring your CEO, X many more dollars on the bottom line at the end of the quarter. And that really raises questions about, class consciousness, engagement with some of these ongoing social issues through psychedelic insight, as well as through the way that these things get deployed back at us, the way that certain organizations and institutions really have their finger on the pulse and are trying to figure out how to utilize these things in ways that reinforce some of these destructive systems. We also have to ask who sets the agenda. So again, considering who's pushing these narratives about mainstreaming, do they have anything to gain from it, whether financially or as far as their own power? So if we see that organizations are set up to profit from the mainstreaming of psychedelics, I think that raises significant questions and conflicts of interest, perhaps, between them and their stated agenda. Similarly, if we see that there are organizations that are interested in, say, occupying spaces where they would be creating permits or particular certifications in order for, say, therapists to work with psychedelics, and there's a whole bunch of money in that particular industry as well, again, I think it raises questions about the motives behind mainstreaming psychedelics and seeing who has what to gain from this. So, like I said, I don't really have answers to these questions, but I do think that they're important to really mull over, and especially when people start bringing them up, push them on why they're holding those positions, push them on why they actually feel that way about them. And finally, the question that really drives all of this is, does mainstreaming psychedelics actually improve our situation as human beings on planet Earth? And if so, how? Right? So again, this is back to the structural analysis. This is back to the notion that just because we give everyone acid doesn't mean we're going to put an end to war. But I think when particularly CEOs and folks that clearly have a lot to gain from the current political system and economic system start throwing millions of dollars at psychedelic research and start talking about the importance of mainstreaming psychedelics, we have to try to understand more long-term what they're seeking from that engagement, what they're looking to do with that. Because ultimately, I think that if we're using psychedelics just to create more apps that are better coded so that various people can pull more money in from them, it doesn't really seem particularly meritorious to me. Now, I know there might be people who disagree with that, and I think there should be room for discussion and space over what we actually feel humanity should be doing, and obviously none of us are going to change that single-handedly. But again, I think there's a whole bunch of really messy conversations that need to be had around that. And this brings me to this idea of recuperation. So recuperation is the notion that certain things that challenge authority and that present threats to established systems of order can in some way be co-opted and turned into things that reinforce that. And this particular quote from Douglas Rushkoff says, "Since the 1960s, mainstream media has searched out and co-opted the most authentic things it could find in youth culture. Whether that was psychedelic culture, anti-war culture, blue jeans culture, eventually heavy metal culture, rap culture, electronica, they'll look for it and then market it back to kids at the mall." And I think in a lot of ways we see that with psychedelics actively. We see that with festival culture. We see that with this sort of sense that this is some sort of chic new trend that's going on, and if you buy the right clothes and take the right drugs and listen to the right DJs or what have you, that you can show up in these spaces and be a part of this thing that's taking place. And even if you don't really understand it, and even if you're kind of a tourist, and even if it feels a little weird to you, hey, come get down with the freaks and see what happens. And, I think, again, it carries this particularly disturbing notion that cuts really shallowly into this, that doesn't actually provide meaningful engagement with what do psychedelic experiences have to offer, what does actually sharing space in these places with similar or even totally differently minded individuals bring into our lives and afford us in our intellectual discussions and in our lived experiences. So the narratives that are coming out around mainstreaming are also particularly telling, I think. This particular quote is from Rick Doblin in Playboy of this past year, and he said, "One of the big mistakes of the 1960s was people identifying as the counterculture. When the crackdown happened, psychedelics got wrapped up with the Cultural Revolution. When you self-identify as part of the counterculture, you check yourself out of things, you kind of marginalize yourself, and you don't ask the system to grow and change." Now, I think the second half of that quote is demonstrably untrue. We can look at abolitionists' role in ending slavery, anarchists in the labor movement, a whole host of outside agitators that really achieved more change in their pushes, which were also viewed as being, too radical, too extreme, unrealistic. And yet, if we look historically, we see that some of those pushes for really extreme and things that were viewed as unreasonable or unachievable at the time actually netted more significant yields than some of the folks who were trying to work quietly within the system to sort of affect slower scale what they felt would be more achievable systemic change. So I think, like I said, the second half of that quote is doesn't hold water. But if we're going to engage with this question of was 60s counterculture a mistake, I think we have to ask whether or not it's a meaningful accusation. And ultimately, at least as presented here, I don't think it is. I think that it's way too vague. It doesn't offer any actual critique or engagement with what groups, what actions, what particulars were problematic. I think the notion of checking out of society just because you've declared yourself to be counterculture is kind of bunk. In fact, if we look at the variety of countercultural movements in the US that cropped up in the 60s, we're talking about things like the civil rights movement. We're talking about women's lib. We're talking about Black Power and American Indian movements. We're talking about the anti-war movement and resistance to the Vietnam draft and the atrocities and horrors that the American military was carrying out overseas. And this implicit notion that either psychedelic users were wrong to engage in these political critiques or that political dissidents were wrong to be engaged in psychedelics because ultimately it meant that these things escaped the lab and were seen as problematic by the government, so they were criminalized, so now we can't have our nice psychedelic research without really working for it. I don't really think that that's valid either. I think that it really raises these questions about where you draw the line when we're talking about morality or when we're talking about how society is structured, right? Because at the point where the US was carrying out all of these atrocities in Vietnam, it seems a little absurd to me to say, hey, wait, if you guys hadn't taken these drugs and had these realizations and caused this whole mess on society by getting out and demonstrating and burning draft cards and engaging in all these other actions, it raises huge questions about where you stand about that U.S. imperial project, about the rapes, the pillaging, the absolute decimation and defoliation through Agent Orange. So I don't think that the folks that are throwing this notion of we should have been more correct and proper and controlled in our psychedelic use have really thought about the broader social implications of what that use led to. Again, there's a very compelling argument, I feel, to present why drugs and radical politics have coexisted for as long as they have. So this raises more questions about the implications for mainstreaming and what actually comes with that. And I think that we have to ask, again, what does mainstreaming look like? What are the dominant components of our social systems, of our institutions, of our culture? Right? We live within industrial civilization. We live within capitalism. If we look at those systems, I think it's probably easy to assert that the greatest good that we can get from that is perhaps modern medical technology, right? Like we can go to hospitals, we can have bones healed, we can have these phenomenal surgeries carried out that extend life, that keep people alive through really traumatic and horrific circumstances. But if we actually look at what it takes to maintain a hospital, it raises this really interesting question, I think. Sort of what is the body count of a hospital, right? So the university hospital near me runs on coal. It runs through a coal-fired power plant. So before we even get to the hospital, all the electricity for that is coming from the fact that they're engaged in mountaintop removal. So they're literally blowing the tops off mountains, collecting the coal, and in the process, absolutely destroying a whole bunch of waterways, ecosystems, killing animals, making people who live in the area sick, right? And then all of that coal gets transported to the to the power plant where it gets used. And there's all the energy to transport that. There's all the energy to like build all of the transportation infrastructure to build the actual plant. And then you look at the hospital itself, right? And you've got all of the concrete that went into that, which is something like, I think, a pound of CO2 for every pound of concrete. So you've got all those emissions. You've got all of the machinery that's in those hospitals, the MRIs, fMRIs, CAT scans, all of the rare earth metals that those require, which all get mined and refined in China. And people have to live with those costs. People live with the pollution from the mining, from the refineries. That's more waterways that are getting despoiled. That's more, air that's toxic, soil that can't grow plants. So you go through and you start piecing that together, looking at all the disposables, all the plastics, all of that gets manufactured, shipped, utilized, et cetera, et cetera. And so at the end of the day, what you see is that there are these acute and pretty severe ecological and human costs associated with running a hospital. And in that sense, right, it becomes not so much about are we saving lives as much as it's about whose lives are we saving and what is the actual cost, what is the actual amount of suffering and ecological destruction that it takes to support being able to save privileged few or being able to offer some of these technologies to relatively better off folks if we look at the global populace. And so when we consider what is mainstream and how things function in the mainstream, right, there are really challenging questions that, like I said, I don't have answers to, but we can't get away from. And as convenient as it is to try to sidestep it, because it's difficult, I think that we owe it to ourselves and each other to actually dig in and see if we can find productive meaning or engagement from trying to unpack some of those challenging questions. So to come back to this idea of structural analysis, again, it's the fact that human societies consist of institutions and systems that affect social dynamics and relationships, and that we as psychedelic folks have to be willing to deploy that and deploy those understandings so that we can analyze those social relationships. Because as we come back with these meanings, as we come back with these insights, as we try to make sense of the world around us, unless we're able to do so in a way that has coherency and actually maps onto the systems that we're up against, we're going to find ourselves ultimately lost without any sense of what to do. And I would say not that employing structural analysis gives a clear sense of what to do, but at least it begins to present some of the systems that are exerting these forces on us and the world around us. And it leaves us with the understanding, I would hope, that changing individual actors doesn't actually affect the broader system. So, a bunch of people got upset about Donald Trump's statements regarding immigrants and his proposed plan to deport however many people he was looking at. But if you look statistically, the Obama administration deported more immigrants than any administration prior, and actually more immigrants than Trump is currently on pace to deport at this moment in time. So again, all of the surveillance and military apparatus that people have been decrying as being used inappropriately under Trump was also expanded under Obama. So again, we have to realize that these systems, whether governmental and political or economic, have all been set up to function in certain ways. And regardless of who's at the helm, they're going to function in those ways. And this holds true whether we're talking about militaries or police, or if we're talking about systems of governance that we come into contact with more or less on a daily basis. And so I think it's important to ask at this point, what has mainstreaming psychedelics actually looked like up until this point? And I think there's 4 areas to talk about. First is the guru model and this shamanic drug tourism. So over the last, 50 plus years, there's been people that are interested in searching out authentic ceremonies and participating in them. Over the last 10 or so years, I would say that that paradigm has sort of taken off in this incredibly accelerated direction of folks who are finding themselves ill-prepared for what they're getting themselves into. And this has to do with a host of things from questionable shamans, retreat leaders, people who are basically looking to make a quick buck off of facilitating these experiences, either because they've heard of them or had limited contact themselves and feel like they have a calling or whatever reason. There's also been a preponderance of people that are selling certificates within our society, folks that will offer shamanic certificates or psychonautic certification and awards, where you pay them X number of dollars and go through whatever initiation process they're offering, and at that point, you're certified in what their system is. And I think that that's rather troubling because it presents this notion of these various people as gatekeepers, rather than the whole experiential component of psychedelics, which should be front and center, in my opinion. Then if we look at psychedelics in the workplace, and most significantly of late has been this fixation by CEOs, particularly in Silicon Valley, on utilizing LSD microdoses for workplace productivity. Things like increasing their coders' creativity, problem-solving abilities, and at the end of the day, hopefully making applications that function better and serve their purpose and therefore yield greater profits. I think it's rather alarming that a substance that 50, 60 years ago was sort of heralded as this total boundary-dissolving experience that could potentially upset society because it presented so much counterintuitive insight into the world around, that all of a sudden it's like, but actually if you only take 10 mics of that, you can do really great work for your boss, and you can show up to work and really knock it out of the park, and everything will keep humming smoothly. To me, I find that kind of terrifying, especially when we consider what it takes to actually support industries like those in Silicon Valley, both in the ecological perspective as well as socially, and looking at the incredible wealth disparity and income inequality that comes out of those sort of arrangements. Then there's sort of this psychedelics for greenwashing, the notion that, taking psychedelics, participating in psychedelic retreat centers or whatever, affords you this soapbox to step onto and present people with notions of how changed you are or how changed the world might be through psychedelics. So there's actually at least one, and I think there's a handful of CEOs who've gone down and participated in ayahuasca and cactus ceremonies, and then made statements along the lines of, Wachuma is the medicine that could bring the whole planet together. Now, mind you, the person who's making this statement is a CEO who runs a manufacturing company and distribution center for questionable workout supplements and other knickknacks. And all of his production relies on industrial processes, right? All of his marketing, all of his engagement with the world around him through his business is relying on these coercive and destructive and exploitative systems. And yet here he is saying that psychedelics might be able to undo that damage. Personally, it seems to me he could just sort of step away from that whole project, let it rot, stop pursuing it, and that would bring him that much closer to actually affecting that change, rather than, coming back and returning to his daily operations. And finally, this notion of psychedelics in the military. MAPS has been focusing on using MDMA for the treatment of treatment-resistant PTSD in military veterans. And I think it raises huge questions about what it means to provide the US military, the largest military in the world by a massive margin, with this sort of material aid, as well as a sort of rhetorical device where they can turn around and say, hey, look, don't worry about the increasing rates of PTSD we're seeing, particularly among drone operators, as we're increasing drone operations around the world, including illegal drone operations. Don't worry about, the effects on the pilots of those. Don't worry about the effects on our operators. We have a cure for that. We'll be able to bring them back into society, to integrate them alongside everyone else, and you won't really have to worry about them as your neighbors, as your peers, as anything. And that, to me, raises really startling questions about what that means for populations overseas. When we see that there's between 1 and 2 million casualties estimated conservatively as collateral damage just from the recent wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, the fact that you can create that distance potentially in those sorts of narratives seems alarming. And the fact that there is no discussion or engagement with the purpose of the American military project, why it's attempting to project hard power around the globe in these ways as the hegemony crumbles, I think it raises questions that have been asked at the margins and things that there have been murmurs about as MAPS has pursued some of these things. But honestly, I'd like to see some of those debates and conversations take place much more front and center, because I don't think you can remove psychedelics from their political context, because I think that ultimately these things will exist and do exist out of the lab, particularly as these therapies go into place, and those have that has fallout for all of us. And unless we're willing to sort of take that to them and ask the difficult questions and engage in those conversations, I think they're just going to do what they want and what they feel is meritorious. So at the end of the day, I think there's this notion of radical psychedelic engagement, which I'd summarize as basically, turning your psychedelic insight into practice, figuring out ways to apply that insight or practice to affect meaningful change in the world around us, and figuring out what kind of world we want to live in. Because ultimately, using psychedelics in and of themselves is perfectly fine and acceptable and can generate incredibly phenomenal neurochemical art at the very least. But I think that when we see some of these tensions that come up within the psychedelic between psychedelic insights and the world that we live in, there's a clear impetus to take them beyond just coming together and discussing our own experiences, or coming together and sharing space and being able to empathize with each other and share those as discrete and significant experiences. I think that there are clear questions that we all need to be asking of ourselves and of each other, if we feel that psychedelics actually have the ability to impact and affect meaningful change on society. I don't think it's about us waiting for heads of organizations or political actors or other, talking figures to make that change for us. I think we've probably all had experiences that present that change as significant and present ideas of what we're looking for and what we'd like in the world. And I think ultimately it's up to us to make that happen. So thank you. So we should have time for a bit of discussion. So I'd like to open this up. And do we have a mic for the audience? Yeah, I'll just repeat whatever.
Hi, my name's Ash from Students for Sensible Drug Policy. Hello. Hi, my name's Ash from Students for Sensible Drug Policy. Quick plug before my question. There's also a panel here tomorrow at, is it 11? At 1 till 3 on pill testing, bunch of international experts, and there's a discussion at 11 a.m. at the Solar Cinema on Monday. And I guess I self-identify as one of those radicals, so you can hear a little bit about what's been happening with grassroots activism here in Melbourne, and I guess around the world in the Psychedelic Society be talking as well. So my question, now that I've given a quick plug, so there's some questions around both the spiritual use and this idea of custodians or gatekeepers that I maybe want to delve into a little bit, because you looked at the negative and problematic aspects of that, which I think are really important questions to ask. But then you've got things like the Church of Santo Daime and like legitimate groups of people coming together around the idea of the spiritual use of these compounds, which I think is a really important side factor to the kind of clinical research that's going on. And so, what role do you see there? Because, I mean, somewhere in the middle there, you've kind of got drug anarchy over here, right? And we kind of have opened the doorway to a lot more people knowing about psychedelic compounds, and so they're kind of out there in the world. And then you've got this idea of like maybe inappropriate custodians. So do you see some kind of middle ground for those two roles there, like to kind of exist, and how would you see that maybe playing out? How can we usefully engage with that?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's middle ground there, and I think there's also sort of like expanded ground, right? In the sense of like, so I'm not against clinical use. I'm not against spiritual use. I think it's important for folks who are operating in those contexts, whether they're spiritual leaders or facilitators or whatever term they prefer, as well as like the MDs that are interested in engaging with the therapeutic approaches, to both recognize sort of this diversity of approaches to psychedelics, right? And I guess the one that I'm leaving out of there is recreational, right? This notion that like you don't necessarily need to be looking for therapy. You don't necessarily need to be looking for some sort of spiritual connection. I think that like my criticism of some of those folks in one sense is the fact that they don't leave the door open for that full plurality and for that full engagement from the community to keep everybody that has their own personal reasons for engaging with psychedelics plugged in and involved. I do think there definitely are legitimate, for lack of a better word, spiritual practitioners that that maybe they function as gatekeepers, the same way that other organized religions, sort of function as gatekeepers to God. Personally, that's not something that I find merit from, or I find beneficial to me. But I definitely see that there are folks who do enjoy approaching it in that way, or who get something very meaningful out of that, not just enjoyment. And I think as far as navigating, my understanding, at least in the US, right, is that they have certain litmus tests for what is a bona fide religion. There was a case that was the Church of the Boohoos that had this really screwy, it was set up as a religion, but it was all tongue-in-cheek the whole way through, right? Like there was no real serious engagement and with creating a serious religion. And you might say, oh well, why was it necessary? And I think ultimately when you're looking at it in a legal context, right, you're going to be bringing that in front of a judge. You're going to be trying to protect it in that way. And the judge in that case was literally like, you've got to be kidding me. I think it was like row, row, row your boat was their sacred hymn or something like that, and a series of other questionable decisions around how they were trying to make more political theater, I think, rather than advance sort of a serious religious protection argument. But that being said, there's a lot of questions around what makes a religion legitimate and who would get to practice in those veins, how that would unfold, who would have, and questions that the DEA raised, particularly around UDV and Santo Daime, was control of ayahuasca entering the U.S. and growing the plants, manufacturing the brews. How is this going to be done? How is it going to be controlled? Can you monitor every single drop of every single compound? And so I think we also hit a lot of really challenging regulatory components when we're talking about psychedelics as religious sacraments within the prohibitionist paradigm. Because I think we can also imagine a world where prohibition doesn't exist, and so maybe these compounds aren't scheduled, so you don't need to fill out DEA paperwork accounting for every milliliter of every single gallon or whatever container of ayahuasca. And I think that presents more interesting terrain for seeing what religions might make use of that, or what spiritual practices might make use of those spaces. I think at the moment, as we've seen with other aspects of prohibition, there's a really strong economic push, for lack of a better term, right? That like people that are running retreat centers in Latin and South America, and people that are running quiet retreat groups throughout the U.S. Are charging an arm and a leg, and they justify it as in the U.S. they justify it as increased legal risks. They justify it as they're a messenger of the medicine, and I think at the point where you don't have all of those different components that come with prohibition, it opens up the terrain for really pushing back on some of those assertions that are currently being made in that like spiritual or sacred place.
Thank you for a very interesting talk. That was awesome.
Thanks.
What I'm interested in is if we imagine a world without prohibition and we imagine the points through which we have to get there, I'm interested in how we can actually do that given the prison industrial complex and the relationship that had with stifling the voices of the radicals in the 1960s,
Yeah.
and how to continue this radical sort of edge, given the context of the systems in which we live with privilege and like inequality of wealth and all of these sorts of things. I'm just interested in your perspectives on that.
For sure. So that's a huge question. I actually gave a talk a few years back on specifically dealing with decriminalization and commodification and what things might look like in a post-prohibitionist world. And that was actually what really sent me on a tear about structural analysis, right? Like the fact that at the end of the day, so in the US we have private prisons, which I don't think exist here, which is a good thing, but also feels like something that shouldn't need to be celebrated. So basically, there's one particular group called the Corrections Corporation of America that actually went on the record and made a statement saying, look, we're opposed to any legislation that would reform drug laws or immigration laws because ultimately drug offenders and illegal immigrants represent our largest incarcerated, our largest carceral bodies. So those are our revenue generators, and we have no interest in giving that up. And again, they felt comfortable enough to come on the record and make these statements because they've got that much power, because they've got that much money, and because they know their positions are ultimately unassailable. So as far as what does it look like to push past that, right? Like you get into huge components of like campaign finance and how would you actually pull the money out of politics. It seems like it should be fairly simple to say that prisons shouldn't be operated for profit, but it also seems fairly simple to argue that the healthcare industry shouldn't be operated for profit. And the way that special interest groups in the United States function, it's all bought and sold. It's all completely out of control of folks that want to actually introduce reasonable legislation because there's such a significant moneyed interest there. So I guess the kind of depressing answer is that like I don't see a way to actually, at least not through the currently established political processes, achieve some sort of end. So let's say I don't see a way to achieve like the end of for-profit prisons and things like that. I do see maybe on the other side, in this like perverse way, like the way that commodification of things like cannabis could actually provide a little bit of an antidote, even if it just like makes for a stranger, more fucked up landscape. So like, one of the things that's been really instrumental in cannabis legalization or decriminalization, I think, has been some of the profits that have been realized by states that have legalized. Looking specifically at Colorado, I think there were a couple surrounding states that actually tried to sue, saying that like the amount of money they were bringing in was creating some sort of problems for them. That whole case was thrown out of court. But more states are legalizing as they see the revenues to be had, as they see that they can fund all of these projects as well as put money in their pockets on the back of weed. So in that way, like, and then I guess we have to take the fact that cannabis interdiction makes up a greater percentage of the actual drug enforcement funding than I think all other drugs combined. So it seems to be kind of a linchpin in the drug war in that sense. So the notion of removing that linchpin through like hyper-commodification of cannabis presents maybe a picture where some of that could be mitigated simply because other right people are getting money in their pockets. And it's not right, yeah, exactly. It's not a pretty picture. It doesn't actually provide any sort of catharsis or like, oh yeah, that's a world I want to be a part of. But I don't. Looking at where the terrain is right now, I don't see a way of upsetting those interests, and it seems like it's getting worse year after year after year. So I'm sorry to be so bleak, but
Yeah, that's fine. That's what I thought. I was just wondering if you had anything else to add.
for sure.
Did you still want to ask a question? Sorry, this guy was really enthusiastic.
If you consider that the most of these psychedelics have grown through indigenous cultures and have been intrinsically part of their cosmology for millennia. And then we look at modern extraction techniques such as removing DMT from the plant and smoking in a completely non-shamanic environment. Are we as enlightened souls in this modern paradigm lacking in that cosmology that was presented to us in our, everyday upbringing that indigenous people were given. Are we at danger of trying to appropriate stuff and just grab stuff from other cultures to try and understand it?
I think it's all about, in that sense, like intention and awareness in some ways, right? Like, I think we can safely state that, like, as folks in industrial civilizations, like, we don't have ties to a lot of those lineages, to shamanic rituals and histories and cultures, and I think acknowledging that is an important component of that. One of the big questions for me has been, why do people find it meaningful to go to different societies and sort of participate in these seemingly culturally voyeuristic ways, where it's like, I would like to go see an authentic ceremony, and that authentic ceremony needs to match my perception of what authentic is, right? And so, like, it raises these really, there was a guy named Geronimo Munoz who sort of likened it to polka, right? And the fact that, or actually to mariachi music in Mexico, right? And the fact that it has heavy influences from polka and Germanic music, and that, like, right? But when you think about it as this authentic Mexican music form. And you begin to unpack it and you see, well, okay, like, there are all these other influences. But then he gives this parable where he says, imagine that there's this Russian guy who's real interested in the American West and cowboys, right? And he gets in his head like, oh, like, I want to go to America and I want to see the most authentic cowboy and participate in that, right? So he goes to the U.S. and he finds a cowboy and, knocks on his door and is like, hey, can I live with you for the next little bit? Can I see what your life is like? And the cowboy's kind of not so into it, but the guy has money and he's really insistent. And he's like, okay, sure, fine, whatever. And so, over the week, the cowboy takes the guy around, and the guy becomes a little bit disillusioned. Like, the cowboy isn't wearing the right hat, and his shoes are a little bit off, and his kids watch TV and radio, and they're just not like the quaint sort of pastoralists that he views them as, right? And so he's like, well, maybe I'll ride it out for a month. And at the end of the month, the cowboy himself is kind of like annoyed that this guy's been hanging around and has all of these questions that don't really make much sense. He doesn't speak the language. And the guy is, at this point, completely flummoxed. Is like, what's going on? This isn't a cowboy. Fuck this. I'm going to actually open up my own cowboy retreat. So instead, so he goes and he sets up a cowboy retreat, catering to Russian tourists, saying, hey, come to my authentic cowboy retreat. And he's got everything, it looks like straight out of Hollywood, right? It's all the right hats, the boots, the spurs, the appropriate saddles, and he does cowboys just like he imagines and just like, really resonates with his soul. And sure enough, there are other Russians who say, oh, wait, that's exactly my impression of cowboys as well. Let me get in on this. Let me be a part of this authentic cowboy retreat, right? And so you get this weird perpetuation of this idea of authenticity, this idea of the projections that we have in our mind about what is or isn't correct in these other cultural contexts that we don't actually exist in. And I think that plays out in these really interesting ways. So, like, I know there are people in certain ayahuasca communities that say, oh, it's completely disrespectful to do an extraction of DMT or extraction of harmala alkaloids because it's disrespectful to the plant spirits. And then, of course, there's the fact that, like, when you first brew that tea, you're doing a crude extraction. You're bringing those alkaloids from the plants into the water. But beyond that, Jonathan Ott actually did, and this isn't to say like this is true for all cases, this is simply one case that presents sort of a counter to that. Jonathan Ott was working with a particular indigenous population and had brought along thin layer chromatography materials. And they did an extraction and they isolated harmine, harmaline, DMT, and he showed them the spots fluorescing on the TLC plates, and their response was, oh, that's the spirit of the plant, right? So they were more than willing to accept and identify the isolated alkaloids as sort of synonymous with the spirit. And so I think we have to be really careful when we're talking about our own histories and engagements with culture with our own understandings of these compounds. And I think in a lot of ways we're lost. Like, we don't have any of these lineages. We don't have something that's being handed down. Most of us, I know, at least speaking for myself, like, all of my experiences with psychedelics, especially early on, were basically trial and error, sort of seeing what worked, what didn't. I mean, brewing ayahuasca early on was just like, okay, like, start with a ratio somewhere and see what, does it do things. And like, I think having people who can pass on techniques, having people who can provide that insight is tremendously valuable. And I think now that psychedelics have been around in industrial contexts for 60 plus years, we have elders in our societies, in our communities, who have some of those experiences. And for better or worse, it's not really structured in that same sense as actual indigenous communities, or right, it comes back to that question of what is community. Like, how do we live within relation to each other, both physically as well as like as far as how we share our ideas, how we interact. And I think that finding ways to reinforce those engagements and interactions is incredibly important, because if we're talking about psychedelic culture as being worth spreading, as being worth propagating, then we have to be able to facilitate people having meaningful and safe, relatively safe, psychedelic experiences, right? Because that's literally what propagates the culture. So again, I think that points back to needing those stories, those elders, those understandings of this is how you work with these compounds to try to produce these things. And it's part of why I think the harm reduction work at events like these are so important, precisely because it presents at least some of that backbone. You got someone over here?
Hey, I wanted to ask what you think about sort of the inherent value of psychedelic experiences, because it seems like it's pretty reasonable to say that some people, when they have psychedelics, have personally transformative experiences that sort of change their attitudes in ways that are subversive to capitalism and, anti the dominant culture. But if you accept that that's true, it kind of mitigates some of the concerns you raised about like CEOs or drone pilots taking psychedelics, because even if they're taking them in these kind of questionable contexts, it seems like there could still be quite significant good that comes from it. So like the whole MAPS approach, you can think of almost like a Trojan horse to enabling those sorts of experiences.
Totally, and Doblin himself is happy to say that, MAPS is sort of Trojan horsing legalization through that. And my concern there is more that, like, the way that you shape a foundation really affects what you can put on that foundation. And sort of, if we Trojan horse psychedelics into legality, right, through the medical model, what does that mean for everything that's not medical, right? And how does that actually play out in these other ways, right? Like, I don't think that there's an argument to be made that the medical approach is the sole legitimate approach to psychedelics. And I'm worried that that type of Trojan horsing will really sort of hem that in and frame it in such a way that it becomes more difficult for people who aren't using it in some sort of therapeutic or medical context to get access in. But beyond that, like, I think with regards to the notion that psychedelics offer these insights that fundamentally challenge some of these components, so they therefore mitigate people taking them in some of those contexts, I think psychedelics serve as catalysts in a lot of ways, and that, like, it depends on sort of what the starting material is, what the person's understandings are about themselves, the world around them, and really what they want. I mean, right, like Charles Manson, didn't really seem to get a lot of productive messaging from psychedelics, or looking at like what various folks associated with MK Ultra carried out, both under the influence as well as like in pursuit of psychedelic research. And so I think that there is evidence, and there's certainly been cases of people who've had complete 180s and changes in their perspectives, and have done about faces in their lives. I mean, I've certainly read some of the recent discussions of angel investors who went down, had an ayahuasca ceremony, and quit their investment jobs. And I think that's more intriguing to me, well, especially depending on what they get into after that, but I think that's more intriguing to me than like some of the heads who wind up dosing and then just going back and carrying out the same thing. in their daily lives, right? Where they have these profound experiences. They say, "Oh my God, these experiences were so profound." But then you look at the day-to-day, and it's back to the grind. At one point, Daniel Pinchbeck, argued that seeing CEOs running around at Burning Man wearing pink tutus and picking up trash off the playa was evidence that Burning Man is fundamentally changing society. Except for the fact that all those folks went back to their jobs, at the end of the week and continued doing the same stuff that they were doing. And so, like, it comes back to the what do you do with it and how does it actually play out. And I know that doesn't make it necessarily easy to answer that abstract, like can this be? And I think it ends up being a case-by-case basis. I think it ends up being a question of what happened to this person in the wake of that transformative experience. Can we?
Hi, my name is Chris.
Hey.
I feel like I have a really clear question, but it's a question about a problem that deals with complexity, so if I end up just rambling, I apologize in advance. I really enjoyed what you were saying about needing to look at all of our systems, that it may not be possible to kind of just fix one thing at a time, like a sort of Jenga tower, that we sort of need to... Sorry, I have anxiety and I just
You're all
can't-
good. No worries.
Aw, thank you, whoever is behind me. Yeah, that it seems more like we need to outline a plan of how all of these systems can be connected to, really make the most optimal society for literally everyone. Like, as crazy as that sounds, like, that, should really be our goal. What's the most optimal society that everybody in it can be as well and as happy as possible? If it means that person has to sacrifice something for something else, like, I think at the end of the day, it's an agreement we could really all make if we had the sort of mathematical proof to say, look, this is how this society will work, and you'll have these freedoms, and you'll get to live your life as free as you possibly can. I think everybody would sign that contract. The problem becomes making it, because no one person on the planet understands all of the systems that we have or has the vision to contemplate all of the systems that we don't have yet. So to me, that seems like the complexity problem that's in front of us, and I spend pretty much all of my spare time thinking about it. Like, what, those three problems. What is the society that we want? What would it actually look like? Why doesn't society currently look like it today? What are the problems that we have? And most complicated of all, how do we move from one to the other? Because first we have to just get people not even to care about it. I think everybody cares about it, but nobody believes that something that elaborate is better. So I suppose I devote a lot of energy to, like, what's the seed that you plant to grow that garden? Like, what's a community that we can come up with online that people are really discussing these things in depth? How do we unite economists with the people that are actually working the farms, to the people that create financial institutions, to the people that do the labor? Like, how can we have that big a conversation? So, I mean, I suppose for myself personally, you see people that just kind of, I've got a really great idea. And the best thing that they can do is just kind of ramble about it online, because the last kind of really frustrating ingredient in that complexity problem is it seems like the people that have these really great realizations, that really feel their hearts open, that genuinely want what's best for everyone, do exactly what you were saying. They step down from their corporate positions. The first thing that they want to do when they realize there's a problem with one person having more power than the other is they want to surrender that power. So how do you organize when the first step that everybody kind of wants to take is to step back and do things more simply?
Sure.
You know what I'm saying? I guess I'm wondering, do you know of any organizations that are having that conversation? Is there a name for that sort of, because it's so hard to talk about because it doesn't even have a name. You just end up kind of rambling, like, do you know what I'm saying?
Yeah, I do, and I would come at it from maybe the other end in some ways, where, like, right, rather than looking to folks at the top to sort of, like, make those engagements and tie things together, like, I'm really interested in sort of self-organizing and, like, communal engagement, like, on the ground level, because I think, to take a moment and speak for everyone here, like I think we all know like what we want or need in our lives. Like I think we're capable of like making those assessments and knowing more or less what we need to get there, like what it takes for us to have the things that we would like, and who we want to have and how we'd like to have, ideally, you know, at least certain components and aspects of our lives organized. I think in a lot of cases we wind up coming up against different aspects of the state when we try to make that happen, right? Like, so if we look at constructs like private property, where you have, you know, millions of homeless people and millions of vacant houses, like those things seem to go right together, right?
Yeah,
like
or obesity and famine. It's like, how can those be two simultaneous problems?
Right. And so I think, so again, so like sort of that, like all of these larger wholes are all made up of, you know, incredibly like tiny components that all exist, right? And like if we look at the way that we order ourselves and organize ourselves and engage with each other, I think it gives insight into how we want to be. And I think it's absolutely a mess. Like I don't think like any sort of transition from where we're at to where we'd like to go, whether, you know, from top down or bottom up, is going to be an absolute mess. I mean, there's no way to undo, to whatever degree we can undo all of the things that are currently set up in the world around us. There's no easy way. Like if you were to, just looking at like industrial civilization, right? Like what do you do with nuclear waste? What do you do with like Superfund sites that actively require like engagement and management through industrial processes to keep them running, right? Like what destruction do you ultimately acknowledge as necessary to hold on to, simply to avoid the larger catastrophes that would follow if you don't engage in it? And so as far as like organizations that are putting people together like that, I'm not really familiar with anything. There might be folks who know. There's somebody smirking over here who may have something to say. And then in addition to that, you know, I think that looking for those moments, like especially, this may be kind of stereotypical, but when you can find people in the streets, like I know that in the US there were a lot of people who said Occupy failed, this, that, and the other. Like it didn't actually hold space beyond when it was evicted. It didn't actually, you know, manifest the change it was talking about. And yet at the same time, looking at all of the organizations that were created out of that, looking at all of the pre-existing organizations that existed and got like huge influxes of people into them in the wake of that, there were a lot of people who basically plugged in and then figured out ways to try to keep that going, even when that larger overarching component failed or was essentially deconstructed.
Sorry, I think it's really great what you just said. It just reminded me of something. Like I too, I was really frustrated watching Occupy, because I was like, oh, this is great. People are caring. That seems like the first logical step. But they were all angry about different things in the end, and the organization aspect of it failed. But what you just said about it having a positive impact, I was at work the other day with like a much younger kid, and like just not a political kid at all, like not quite informed about these issues at all. And at one point it just kind of came in conversation. He's like, oh, did you ever hear the concept of the 1%ers? And I'm like, it's great that you know what that is. It's great that it's something that you can Google and look into, even if it's just like, yeah, even if that's the strongest impact that it has is people just like seeing the door, even if it takes them 15 years to walk through it.
For sure.
Yeah, thank you.
Hi everyone, I just wanted to add, I work with Ash over there with Students for Sensible Drug Policy. So just to make it super clear to everyone, like yes to the answer of who are the people and who are the organizations and who's doing what. There's a whole scene, and we need help. Okay, and some of the questions that I've heard, all the questions that I've heard, like everyone clearly gets it, everyone's clearly on the same page, and there's so much work to be doing. And we're with Students for Sensible Drug Policy, we work with EGA up there, there's Dance Wise Harm Reduction Victoria, Australian Psychedelic Society, like it's all taking off. And please come speak to us, we've got flyers, there's the talk tomorrow at 1 p.m. and 12 p.m. on Monday. So yeah, 11 p.m. on Monday, thank you. 11 a.m., sorry, cool.
Oh, we got a question over here.
Hey, I'm Sam. Just wondering, obviously you've talked a lot about psychedelic impacts and cultural trends from recreational use to spiritual use to medicinal use. And I was wondering, and obviously those trends and how they play out on a broader social scale, but if you're not comfortable talking about it, it's okay. But I was wondering what role psychedelics have, or I imagine have played a part in your life in the past, but currently now as a relatively functional member of society, do you still utilize psychedelics in any of those three categories, or is it what part does psychedelics play in your life now?
Totally. I think for me, like at this point, and one of the reasons that I'm so interested in that diversity of approaches and sort of trying to emphasize it is because that psychedelics have done, sort of all three for me, right? Like I've had spiritual experiences, I've had therapeutic experiences, I've had recreational experiences, and depending on at this point, like what the context is and what the substance is, like I don't really know what's gonna come out of any of those spaces, which again is why I feel like it's important to hold room for all of those as legitimate and possible outcomes. At this point, I would say, in environments like this, I find there's definitely like good potential for recreational use for things that, carried some of that ecstatic joy and that make me feel a sense of play and like engagement that reminds me a lot of some of the freedom of childhood in some ways. I find, the utilization of things like ayahuasca or even a combination of like cubensis mushrooms and harmala alkaloids as offering a lot of really beneficial therapeutic insight, conversations with the self, realizations and insights into patterns of behavior, things that those things that sort of like that you do that sort of sit right in front of your face that you don't see them because they're so close to you. I find psychedelics are incredibly helpful for identifying and picking those things apart. And then honestly, like, there's still, I find a lot of increased feelings of openness, like stress relief, just general senses of well-being in the afterglow periods of a lot of these compounds. And it makes it easier to be in the world. Like I feel less reactive. I feel less at odds when other people are having a rough day. Like it's easier to find some space around that. And to be clear, like I don't dose psychedelics with any sort of regularity at this point in my life. I've gone through incredibly high periods of use of like DMT and other things in the past. And at this point, I guess I try to figure out what makes sense, what works, what fits, and also looking from experience to experience, seeing the benefits that came or didn't come with a particular trip might give insight about how ready or interested I am in dosing again in close proximity, or if it makes more sense to wait, or really I think questions of intention, set and setting are important for everyone.
Hi. I guess my question is a little bit broad, but it's approaching it from a more futurist perspective of it seems to me the past 60 or 70 years, psychedelics have been kind of coupled together with technology in a lot of ways. And hence, when they went underground and the internet was born and they sort of sprung up again, they seem to me fairly interlinked. And I was just wondering, as we are rapidly approaching something as big as the singularity, when we finally create something that's smarter than ourselves, whether or not you think this is going to be a positive or negative thing in terms of the psychedelic renaissance, I guess. Because we might have a lot more free time to be exploring our consciousness, but at the same time we might have incredibly new, powerful tools of repression.
Totally. So I'm not super familiar with, with those arenas of computer science and all of that. So I'm going to come at this again from like more of the structural sense, which is like, right, like technology can be deployed in all of these different ways. And so when we look at like automation on the back of, say, AI or what have you, I think it's kind of terrifying in the sense of, you know, we look at the Great Depression and the unemployment rate, you know, being, what, 5-10%, something like that. And then considering that automation, you know, we could see 25 to 50% unemployment in a paradigm of late-stage capitalism where, you know, people who run businesses don't seem to be interested in providing some sort of universal wage or living whatever to support supplanted workers. You know, I see essentially huge potential for surplus populations and automation, and then that feeds right back into that earlier horror story about for-profit prisons and, like, you know, how do you put surplus populations to work? How do you make them profitable? How do you make them valuable to society? So with regards to psychedelics, I don't, on like the broader scale of the way that I would see that tipping just based on my own dystopian visions, it's kind of terrifying. On the smaller scale, I think there are really interesting things in a research context to come out of artificial intelligence and psychedelics. So like the notion of using AI to map out synthesis pathways that maybe a human wouldn't think of. And hopefully, you know, whether developing novel compounds or novel synthesis routes for already known compounds, it seems like there's a lot of really interesting work that could be done in those spaces, and I would be curious to see what comes out there. But looking at society on that broader sense, I don't know that like automation and singularity has any particular beneficial effects for like the psychedelic paradigm. Although I think that you'll certainly find a lot of psychedelic authors talking about it as it happens. Sorry. All right, so I think that's it on time.
Hello there. Well, I have one last question and a slight commentary as well. Like, I'm very interested in the questions you raised about the commodification of psychedelics and their potential mainstream distribution. And I'm aware that things can get pretty nasty in the way we already see with legal drugs such as tobacco and alcohol, and there's hardly anything that would terrify me more than big LSD or big mescaline, where we have these massive establishments now advertising these drugs as something that needs to be purchased, again, to complement something that is fundamentally incomplete unless you make a purchase. And then we could turn something as beautiful as magical LSD into the new Disneyland that needs a new revenue stream and whatnot. And I personally have seen a potential third way, which for many can be counterintuitive, but for me makes a lot of sense and revolves around concepts that might be very triggering for some. And I see this kind of distribution to make sense within a framework that has very diverse interests, because otherwise you become very focalized on something that can become maladaptive. And I don't think there's anything around that has more diverse interests than the state. So for me, something like psychedelics may be introduced in a healthy way through a centralized system, giving the state the monopoly to distribute these compounds. Because once this becomes a public interest, then all these contrasting phenomena might cancel each other out. When prisons are centralized, every prisoner is not a client, it's a burden. So the state has very little interest to pack prisons up. When the public has control over the health system, every single patient is a burden. So you don't want to make them sick. You want to promote health policies and whatnot. So for drugs, that's again very interesting, because if the state is providing these things and it's getting every single penny in revenue and taxes, then there's very contrasting interest there. Because if the health system is suffering from people getting drugs, then the state itself will control the distribution. Is he going to be able to give a 2-minute commentary? Or all right, cool. Sweet, anyway, you can have your conversations among themselves. And this is my little stint, 50% of it anyway. Good luck. Happy Rainbow.
Thanks for coming out, y'all.